On the 28th of June 1950, a gaggle of single-engined aircraft appeared in the sky over Suwon airfield. They dropped to low level and they strafed the ramp, upon which was scattered a range of US transport and combat aircraft. Climbing away, the Yaks and Ilyushin spotted a C-54 on approach and raked it with cannon fire. The big transport somehow managed to survive and escape, but it would crash on its return to Ashir in Japan. News of this, the second such raid on Suwon that day, reached MacArthur. The first American Caesar was somewhat agitated by this news. For the time being, the air bridge was the only mechanism that the US had to bring reinforcements onto the Korean peninsula and evacuate the injured and those non-combatants who were still in the country. The unexpected threat presented by North Korea's modest collection of Soviet piston-engined fighters was unwelcome news. He therefore ordered the Far East Air Force to sort things out. Thus far restricted to close support sorties, you might imagine that being allowed to roam north and destroy the KPAF at its bases would be welcome news to the Air Force's commanders. But it was not just US ground forces that had been caught on the hop by Kim's offensive. Thief's options were pretty limited when it came to any sort of offensive action. They could barely mount an effective combat air patrol over South Korea. MacArthur's order therefore ended up with the commanders of the 8th and 13th Light Bomber Squadrons, which had been assembled at Ashir, Japan, between the 25th and the 27th of June. These squadrons both flew the veteran B-26 Invader. They'd already flown a handful of sorties thus far, losing 4 of their 26 operational aircraft in the process. The order to make a maximum effort attack on the KPAF's main base at Haizhou outside Pyongyang was met with a degree of trepidation. The Invader had never really been a particularly popular aircraft in Thief. When it had first been issued to them in June of 1944, they had quickly decided that the new Douglas bomber was badly designed and unsuitable for the long-range, low-level missions that predominated in the theatre. In response, Douglas had somewhat fixed the Invader's visibility issues to port and starboard caused by the big Pratt & Whitney engines by raising the canopy a bit and removing some of the more prominent frames. But Thief's aviators still regarded the aircraft's firepower as inadequate and its range as substandard. And in general, they'd basically decided that they didn't like it and they didn't want it, even though by the end of hostilities, 11 wings were in the process of being equipped with the then A-26. 250 were in the inventory when Japan surrendered. Not all of these aircraft were drawn down during the years of peace. In fact, officially at least, Thief had 73 invaders on charge on June the 25th, 1950. But only 2 squadrons were in fact manned and operational, and neither was truly ready for action. Although they got plenty of flying time in Japanese skies, they did precious little tactical training. For the most part, the squadron had been occupied with training pilots, few of whom had even a year's experience on the Invader. Most of the bombardiers hadn't looked through a bomb sight in months when the order to strike came. They'd have to do their best with muscle memory and didn't even have bombing tables that told them the rate of fall and speeds for dropping various types of bombs. 18 B-26s were nevertheless tasked with a strike on Pyongyang. One by one, they lifted off at around 4:15 p.m. on the 29th, so that they had reached the target area at dusk. The weather in Japan was poor. The B-26s climbed through low overcast to 6,000 feet to assemble, and then headed out over the Sea of Japan. Crossing the Korean coast, they climbed to 10,000 feet as they approached Pyongyang. Their arrival apparently took the North Koreans completely by surprise. The crews could see dozens of figures running around the base perimeter and around the aircraft lined up there. 5 fighters did, however, start to taxi out onto the runway as the high-flying invaders approached. They frantically tried to scramble just as the leading B-26 let go its load of fragmentation bombs right on top of them. 3 Yak-9s vanished in the hail of shrapnel, but 2 managed to get airborne as the remaining invaders liberally plastered the field with bombs. Incensed, the North Korean pilots chased the invaders as they turned for home. Unfortunately for them, they had apparently received no training in how to engage a bomber. The invaders' rear gun turrets blasted away with 50 caliber machine guns. The leading Yak took a hit in the engine and it span away, trailing smoke. The other decided that discretion was the better part of valor and broke off the chase. 19 Yaks, representing nearly 30% of the North Korean fighter force, were destroyed in just this one raid. The hangars, barracks, and fuel dump were either destroyed or set on fire. In even better news, the entry of Australia into the war meant that the B-26 squadrons could now move closer to the action at Iwakuni. The period from July to August was when the B-26 crews were under maximum stress. UN air power was the only thing keeping the North Koreans from rolling over the scratch defenders and pushing them all off the peninsula. Eventually, the only foothold left to the UN forces was at Pusan. Little known to its defenders, who must have thought they were impossibly outmanned and outgunned, in reality the North Koreans were out over their skis by this point. Although they required a significantly smaller logistics train than their enemies, the North Korean army had lost most of its experienced troops, the majority of its tanks, and many field commanders. B-29s had flattened every piece of infrastructure north of the 38th parallel. Their offensive was essentially spent by the time of Incheon. The B-26s were not only able to strike the northern forces from Japan, they were the only asset in Thief's inventory, besides the grossly unsuitable F-82 twin Mustang, that was able to operate around the clock. The North Koreans soon realised that exposing their troop and supply movements during the day was suicidal, as they'd be set upon by Mustangs, Corsairs, Panthers, Shooting Stars, and Sky Raiders. So they moved to the hours of darkness. As with every other tactical role, the two Japan-based squadrons had not trained or prepared for night interdiction. They were forced to learn on the job. From August, B-26s were dispatched from Japan to roam over Pyongyang and other key areas overnight, waiting until they saw lights from trucks and trains and then swooping down to bomb and strafe them. They were a more heavily armed version of the North Korean night hecklers that irritated UN forces in the hours of darkness. Navigation for the B-26 crews was by dead reckoning at this stage, so even getting into position was a challenge for the overworked Invader crews. In general, they'd be armed with a bomb bay full of 100-pound general-purpose bombs and 8 machine guns in 4 underwing pods. This gave excellent firepower to the hard-nosed B-26, which thus packed either 14 or 16 guns in total. Sometimes the invaders would be called in to provide close support to troops in contact on the Pusan perimeter. Their firepower caused horrific casualties amongst attacking troops. In these missions, they'd sometimes work alongside C-47 flare ships dropping Navy Mark 8 flares, which would illuminate targets for the invaders to swoop in on. This tactic was successful until Thief realised they'd used all of the parachute flares in the theatre and had to stop. 280-pound M81 fragmentation bombs were the weapon of choice for attacking troop concentrations. In one incident later in the war, the B-26s caught a large formation of Chinese troops out in the open massing for attack. After the event, US troops estimated the body count on that one mission at 3,000 killed. The crews also developed strafing skills that maximised the length of their passes in the brief illumination of the flares and the difficult geography of the mountainous terrain. Every attack in Korea required a good understanding of geometry. Because the invaders were heavily taxed in the first month of the war, Thief requested an additional B-26 bomb group. The request was approved, but the only option was to activate a reserve unit because no other was available. In this case, it was the 452nd Bomb Wing, and it consisted of 3 light bomber squadrons and a light night intruder squadron, the 728th, 729th, 730th, and, you've guessed it, the 731st Light Bomber Squadrons. The wing was activated on the 10th of August 1950, but it wouldn't be in theatre until the middle of October because of the need to train the crews on their reconditioned aircraft. About 1,050 invaders were left in the US inventory in June 1950, although only 350 were actually operational in the USAF and another 150 in reserve units. This was the remainder of 2,500 produced during the war. Although Invader production had started in the spring of 1944, it had taken a long time to ramp up to the full rate of 500 aircraft a month. For this reason, less than a quarter of the Invaders built had ever made it to the war zones in Europe and the Pacific. It was a refined rather than a spectacular aircraft, typical of its designer Ed Hyman's work. 50 feet long with a 69-foot wingspan, it was powered by a pair of 2,000 horsepower supercharged radials. With that much power, it could make 350 miles an hour in level flight when fitted with a gun nose packed with 850 caliber machine guns, or a shade over 370 with the plexiglass bombardier nose in its northern bomb sight. £6,000 of stores could be shifted, 4,000 in the internal bomb bay and the rest under the wings. The Invader therefore offered far more firepower than F-51 Mustangs or F-80 Shooting Stars. The downside was lack of speed. The Mustang was 100 miles an hour faster, the jet-powered Shooting Star was nearly 250 faster. And just as in the European theatre during the Second World War, the Invader's large size would prove to be a dangerous issue when the aircraft was employed at low level. Because of the demand for the type, in August 1950, the Air Force Materiel Command launched an urgent project called Hold Off to recondition B-26s, F-51s, and B-29s for service in Korea. These aircraft were removed from storage facilities, in the case of the Invader at Ogden and Sacramento air depots and Peote, Texas. Douglas was given a contract to recondition 147 aircraft. Ogden refurbished another 103 at its own facility, for an initial total of 250 aircraft. 56 of the ones from Ogden were modified into RB-26s with the shore-ran navigation system. Parts were the next problem, and were solved in part by reclaiming 39 older airframes at Peote, 28 at Sacramento, and 100 at Ogden. The speed of the reconditioning and re-equipping effort unfortunately meant that the units in Korea operated a mishmash of aircraft. They had some with the original 2 turrets, they had some with just the dorsal turret, some with 6 gun noses, some with 8 gun noses, plus those with the glazed noses. They also had aircraft with the relatively rare fitment of 6 wing guns, in addition to the majority that were just wide for the 8 wing guns in pods. Oh, and there were also variants in hardpoint numbers, ratings, and configurations, as well as wiring systems and general electronics fitment. Squadrons receiving replacements could easily get a hard nose to replace a glazed nose and various other variations. It was a serious pain for maintainers already struggling with sortie rates and poor quality facilities on the peninsula. For the pilots, it also meant that they might reach for a control in a pitch-black cockpit only to find some other functional dial beneath their fingertips. This was particularly an issue with weapons control, as their position had changed multiple times during the original Invader production run. There were other issues with the Invader by the time it was deployed to Japan. Invaders had originally been equipped with de-icing gear for the engine cowls, the outer wing surfaces, and the windscreen. Either through neglect or removal for some other reason, this gear was not available when the Invaders arrived in theatre. This was something of an issue, as the Korean winter was ferocious and the Invader was quite sensitive to the aerofoil surfaces being disrupted by ice. Worse still for the crew, the aircraft had no heaters, either for the pilot and bombardier at the front or the gunner in his lonely post in the tail. Although they were issued with thick, heated gloves, many pilots chose to fly without them to improve their feel for the aircraft. This initially didn't seem to present too much of an issue. After the landings at Incheon, the UN forces rapidly rolled up the peninsula. By the end of October, it looked like the war would be over by Christmas. Then, on the 2nd of November, the US 8th Cavalry suddenly found themselves engaged at close quarters by a vast and aggressive new opponent. The Chinese army had entered the war, deploying literally hundreds of thousands of troops to prevent their somewhat irritating North Korean allies being annihilated. Once again, the force of B-26s were heavily engaged, both in daylight hours and at night, to try to staunch the flow of men and materiel going south. Heavy ground fire, and now also the threat from Russian MiG-15s, presented new challenges to the Invader crews as they roamed across the countryside. The attack-focused Invaders were often guided to their targets by the hard-working squadron of RB-26 reconnaissance Invaders. These were mostly modified C models with the glass nose and bomb sight, but no machine guns. They also lacked rear turrets, which reduced drag and potentially increased speed to 425 miles an hour. Where the rear turrets had been was a shore-ran, short-range radar navigation set, and a LORAN, long-range navigation set. The shore-ran set had a 3-inch screen in what had been the gunner's station, and it picked up signals from 2 radio transmitters. The signal from each station was displayed as a blip on the screen. When the blips converged, the aircraft was over the target. The system could be used for blind bombing, and was also useful in orienting the RB-26s in poor weather and at night. The RBs had bomb-dropping controls in the refitted gunner's station so that flares could be precisely dropped in order to illuminate targets for other aircraft to attack under. The reconnaissance Invaders flew routes up and down the coast and over the centre of the peninsula, searching for targets. When they found something, they'd wait for the regular invaders to arrive and then light the target with flares. Once the mission was complete, they'd go back in and take pictures. This effort peaked with Operation Strangle in June 1951, which focused on the road network that was supporting the Chinese move south. Single invaders flew over that network all night, watching for activity in the Black Korean night. For a while, the Invader units experimented with using searchlights that had been originally intended for hunting submarines in the Second World War. They were carried under the aircraft's wing in a large pod that somewhat reduced the speed and range of the aircraft. It also generated a massive amount of heat and therefore could only be used for 50 seconds at a time. Although the searchlight did attract rather a lot of enemy fire, it also scared the hell out of truck drivers, who apparently regularly crashed their vehicles when caught in its beam. But the loss of an Invader crew using the light on the 14th of September 1951, which resulted in a posthumous Medal of Honor for Captain John Walmsley, led to use of the searchlights being stopped. Although the Chinese were adept at concealing their road convoys and often resorted to simply lugging supplies on their backs, trains at least presented consistently enticing targets for the invaders, who went after them with M47 firebombs, a range of general-purpose bombs, frags, 5-inch rockets, and machine gun fire. The train crews were not suicidal, though. They ran their locomotives as fast as possible between tunnels on the mountainous railroads, pausing to hide there if they heard the drone of engines overhead. Some of the runs were as short as a mile long. Concentrations of anti-aircraft machine guns and cannons were positioned on ridges that the invaders and other aircraft used on their ingress and egress runs, subjecting the crews to terrifying volumes of defensive fire. If there were no trains on a track, then sometimes the invaders would blow up a junction or other bottleneck with 500-pound delayed fuse bombs, and then wait for the train to stop before pounding it. They'd also drop 20-pound anti-personnel bombs that would go off when touched by crews trying to fix the track. Maddeningly, despite these efforts, the tracks that they put out of action one day were usually repaired by the next night. So the invaders also started to attack the villages near to the tracks in which they believed the labourers were housed. Although precision was attempted, there was almost certainly collateral damage. It was never far away in the Korean War. In 1953, as the war was winding down, the USAF deployed a secret new weapon in the battle with the trains. This was Project Redbird and consisted of an ANAS-1 infrared sensor developed by Bell Labs installed in an invader's nose. The system's sensor was cooled by packing it with dry ice before the mission. The operator used a 3-inch display to see the heat's emissions it picked up and relay instructions to the pilot. When the aircraft passed over a train, the display would light up with a spider of traces. A 20-pound firebomb would immediately be dropped by the Hunter aircraft so that the accompanying killer could make its attack on the illuminated target. Although the sensor was apparently effective in locating the trains, it gave no indication about how the train was moving, and therefore it was far from a perfect system. A good amount of luck was required. And of course the system would be heavily refined before its next outing in the war in Vietnam. The other option was to attack the trains on the long stretch of track south of the Yalu River. This was, however, very hazardous because of the volume of guns arrayed on the sides of the valley, which meant that attacking there almost certainly meant getting hit. But in fairness, there were many ways of getting hit. One invader bombed a siding at night only to discover that they'd blown up a huge pile of bricks. These promptly pelted the aircraft as they fell back to earth. A brick smashed the pilot in the face, knocking him out and ultimately costing him the use of his left eye. Other bricks blasted the aircraft, flattening the leading edges of the wings and tail. Somehow the navigator wrestled control of the aircraft, leveling it off at 50 feet until the pilot came to and somehow got his ship home. Reading all of these stories makes you realize that the air war in Korea was no cakewalk. Surviving 50 sorties was a minor miracle. Despite the demands on the aircraft, the total force of invaders never exceeded 6 squadrons of light bombers. The 452nd Bomb Group moved from Japan to Pusan West, or K9, on the 23rd of May 1951. That reduced travel time to target area and thus offered potentially increased sortie rates and lower levels of crew fatigue. They were joined on the peninsula by the 3rd Group in August. The 3rd were based at Kusan, or K8. That allowed Korea to be split into 2 areas of responsibility, with the 3rd owning the west and the 452nd the east. Although initially quite challenging to operate from, the old Imperial Japanese bases were improved into proper facilities with concrete runways and taxiways, better buildings, fuel and ammo dumps, and so on. Aircraft ready rates declined from 78% in Japan to 65% in Korea, but they steadily got better as maintenance personnel got used to their new digs. Although attacking at night was definitely preferred by the crews, they were regularly called upon for daylight missions too. The threat of MiG-15s, which in truth was more of a fear than a regular problem because of the relatively small numbers of the fighters, meant that the Invaders required accompaniment by F-86s, Meteors, or whatever was available. As in the Second World War, two types of Invader were deployed to Korea. The hard-nosed A-26B had the gun nose. The plexiglass-nosed A-26C had the bomb sight and no guns. In some ways, the latter was more useful in Korea as it offered better accuracy from medium altitudes and was a better pathfinder. Better still, the glazed nose made it easier for the bombardier to spot truck headlights at night. The pilot in the Invader had poor visibility forward and down. The northern bomb sight could also be used to retain target position even after trucks turned off their lights. But of course, the glass-nosed aircraft had substantially less gun firepower than the hard nose. Most had just 2 machine guns, each with 200 rounds. Just once in a while, the Invaders got an opportunity to take a little revenge. And it was one of the glass-nosed aircraft that scored the type's second and final air-to-air kill of the war. The North Korean equivalent of the Invader was the PO-2, a clunky, obsolete biplane trainer. Their crews would fly south at glacial pace to drop hand grenades on UN troops, and if they were very bold, any parked aircraft they could find at airfields. On the night of the 23rd of June 1951, Captain Richard Hayman and his crew were returning from a mission up north. They were flying a glass-nosed aircraft that was a gas guzzler, and they were therefore going back home early with a slug of .50 caliber ammunition on board for their podded underwing guns. As they flew south, the air controller, call-sign Dentist, came on the air and asked if anyone had any ammunition aboard. Hayman answered and was vectored towards a low-flying bogey. They descended to 1,000 feet and were then told that they needed to slow down to 100 knots, which was well below the Invader's stall speed. So they lowered the flaps on the landing gear, opened the bomb bay and the engine cowl, slowing to 130 knots with the throttles as far forward as they would go. They had now dropped below radar coverage, so their only sensor was the Mark I Model 0 human eyeball. Suddenly, they saw the PO-2 heading right for them. Turning around, they gave chase. The PO-2 pilot didn't fancy being dead, so every time the Invader crew got a bead on the biplane, it turned back into them. After 10 minutes of this, they thought they'd finally lost the irritating aircraft when suddenly they spotted it right down on the deck, flying over a river right between the banks. It stood out against the water, which was reflecting the moonlight. Drawing a bead on it, Hayman gave it a burst of fire, raking the fuselage. The PO-2 went down immediately, although apparently the crew escaped as no bodies were found in the wreckage. Retelling these stories makes it seem that North Korea was a target-rich environment. In reality, most missions were completed with no sightings and no action. It didn't make them any less dangerous, though. 41 B-26s were lost to non-enemy causes on operations and 71 simply disappeared. 48 losses could be directly attributed to ground fire. 1 aircraft was shot down by an unidentified enemy aircraft and 35 were lost in non-operational accidents. In general, flying the Invader was one of the most dangerous aviation assignments in the Korean War. A B-26 went down every 300 sorties, making it comparable to the B-29, F-84 and F-80 in terms of danger level. Only the F-51 Mustang community enjoyed worse odds. One of those was lost every 194 sorties. B-26s flew 60,096 sorties, about average for a USAF type. This is made more impressive when you consider the small number of aircraft that were in the theatre at any one time, though. The first half of 1951 was particularly brutal in terms of aircraft losses and general wear and tear on aircraft that were essentially war surplus and not expected to have particularly long service lives. In February, FIF asked Air Force Headquarters to increase the number of Invaders in a squadron from 16 to 24. This was denied because there weren't enough crews or functioning B-26s. By May, 37% of the original Invaders assigned to Korea had been lost. The 729 squadron was down to only 8 aircraft. This led to the planned rotation of crews back to the US after 40 missions being delayed until later in the year. The low point of inventory within FIF came in the spring of 1952. Only 187 total aircraft were on charge to the command at that point, and many of those were completely worn out. It was only in September of 1952 that both wings returned to having 48 operational aircraft available. Crews were another matter. Without time to train them on low-level operations, accident levels were high, and it wasn't as if there was a steady stream of volunteers waiting to fly dangerous missions in an unpopular war. This was also the point in the war at which lack of functioning production lines supporting the B-26 became most critical. The 5th Air Force began to receive aircraft that were functionally okay, they flew and everything worked, but they were from the earliest production B-26s off the line. Some of them even had the original flush canopy with heavy bracing that had caused FIF to reject the type back in 1944. A team at Miho Air Force Base in Japan was created to refit these misfits for frontline use. Operational and political issues aside, the Invader was a rarity in the Korean War. The type served from beginning to end with no reduction in its importance or efficiency. It ruled the skies up north, clogging up communist supply lines and drastically reducing their freedom of operation. Whereas in June 1951, the Invader was part of a scratch force of tired and obsolete aircraft, in 1952 and 53, it operated as part of a team alongside some of the most sophisticated planes in the US inventory, F-94B Starfires and Marine Corps F-3D Skyknights. The 8th Light Bomber Squadron dropped the first US bomb of the war, and fittingly it also dropped the last. An RB-26C was the last UN aircraft to fly north of the 38th parallel to assess the damage caused in that strike. All aircraft returned to base safely. And with that, the war was over. In the USAF, the Invader was replaced by Martin B-57 Canberras within a matter of 3 years. Some aircraft did, however, remain in the US inventory. A decade later, they would find themselves fighting another war in Asia.